This week, we read two probably most famous stories in the Hebrew Bible. The story of the flood and the story which is known as the Tower of Babel. In the beginning of the parasha, God decides to cause a flood that will destroy the world, sparing only Noah's family and the animals that Noah gathers on the ark. Probably I don't even need to tell any of you this story, because it became cultural knowledge, general knowledge for most of us. At the end of the same portion, in the post-flood era, people started to build the city and the tower, which aimed to reach God. God scattered the people and created different languages so that they don't understand each other. And probably I didn't need even to tell you this story either. Both stories are so well known to the most of people in the Western world that often it is a challenge to find a new perspective in a familiar text. This is when traditional modes of interpretation, of Jewish interpretation, come to help. These modes are summarized in the Hebrew acronym Pardes. Each consonant letter of this word, Pardes, which by the way means heavens or paradise from Hebrew. So each consonant of this word has a meaning. The letter Pei, the first letter, stands for Pshat, literal meaning of the text. When we read the Bible as a novel, or narrative, trying to understand the plain text, the plain meaning of the text. The second letter is Reish, which stands for Remez, in Hebrew, meaning hint, or the deep hidden or symbolic meaning beyond a literal sense. This is the main mode of interpretation, perhaps you will read in commentaries or hear from rabbis during sermons and Torah introductions. Dalet, the third letter, stands for Drash, from the Hebrew word inquire or seek, or maybe to require, demand. It is the comparative or midrashic meaning, as giving through similar occurrences. So when we have one story in one place and the other story in another place, and we compare them to each other. And the last one is Sod, translating from Hebrew as secret, mystery. This is the esoteric or mystical meaning, as giving through inspiration or revelation. When you repeat the same story again and again, and people know it so well, it is not enough to look at one story. It is the time to look at the story in the context. Let's see what two famous stories have in common. I mean the story of the flood and the Tower of Babel, and what we can learn from the fact that they are placed next to each other. Noah was a righteous man in his generation, says the text. However, the rabbis debate whether Noah would have been considered righteous in other generations as well. Perhaps his perfection was only relative. In his generation of wicked people, he could be considered righteous, but in the times of higher moral standards, he would not be considered so righteous. In fact, we never read that Noah argues with God. He simply listens to what God says and acts on his orders, accepting everything. This led some commentators to call Noah, and I quote, the man in a fur coat who ensures his own comfort while ignoring his neighbor. It was the personal choice of Noah not to try to save other people. Unlike, for example, Abraham and Moses, who will do that in the forthcoming chapters. We all know the story of the Tower of Babel. People were so arrogant that they wanted to build the tower and be like God. Therefore, God punishes people. However, Midrash takes a very different view. And Midrash says, many years passed in building the tower. It reached so great a height that it took a year to mount on the top. A brick was therefore more precious in the sight of builders than a human being. If a person fell down and died, none took notice of it. But if a brick dropped, they wept, because it would take the whole year to replace it. Sometimes we can be so engaged in achieving our goals that we forget about the most basic moral principles. Sometimes we occupy ourselves in performing acts of kindness that we do not notice how we can harm other people who are next to us. Sometimes we are so busy to think about big structures, businesses, that we forget that our people need meals and support here and now. Sometimes we hear about the issues in our society but ignore them because we think that it is not about us. It is important to engage in charity and external social action projects. However, there comes a time when we need to put our own house in order and reflect on ourselves. A teaching from Rabbi Israel Salanter, the founder of what is called now Musar movement, the ethical mindfulness movement within Judaism. He said, "When I was a young man, I wanted to change the world, but I found it was difficult to change the world, so I tried to change my country. When I found I could change my country, I began to focus on my town. However, I discovered that I couldn't change the town. And so, as I grew older, I tried to change just my family. Now, as an old man, I realize the only thing I can change is myself. But I've come to recognize that if long ago I had started with myself, then I could have made an impact perhaps on my family. And my family and I could have made an impact on our town. And that in turn could have changed the country, and we could all indeed have changed the world. Sometimes by building big structures in our lives, we forget about people who stand behind them. Sometimes we are so occupied by our own comfort that we ignore the needs of others. Sometimes we need a flood, the flood to awake. Sometimes we need to see arrogance in others to recognize it in ourselves. Sometimes it is time to change, just to change yourself and nobody else. Perhaps the context of these two stories, which are placed next to each other, and the meaning behind them cannot be more appropriate for introducing a new study course. And you will see the details of this study course a bit later on the screen, but not now. the synagogue's leadership made a decision to organize a new Tuesday evening program called Racism, identifying it, learning about it, combating it. It will start early in November. This course is our opportunity to look at ourselves, to learn what we can do to make sure that we are truly an inclusive and welcoming community for everyone, regardless of their gender, sexuality, color of skin, or accent. At the end of the flood story, the rainbow became a symbol of reassurance and safety. Perhaps we all should become little rainbows for people around us. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will. And Shabbat.